So I'll start with some thank yous, then go to K's. Is anyone like that already? Okay. So first, I'd like to thank our captains from my last year, novice year, Pranav and Meta. They're right there. Give them a round of applause. And specifically with the both of them, I'd like to thank Pranav for being a really good and supportive friend, and Meta for being a really supportive sister, even when I get destroyed by good teams. Then I'd like to thank my dad for tolerating how much I care about debate. If it weren't for him, I don't think I would even be doing debate. And then I'd like to thank my mom for allowing me to do debate in the first place, because she's always been pretty conservative with what I want to do, but she's let me do this. I'd like to thank Arnav's mom for being also really supportive. She flies us out everywhere. Whenever my dad can't go, she comes. She flew us out to the tournament where we got our first bid. Then I'd like to thank our sponsor, Mrs. Berkshire, for always being super supportive, coming to all of the tournaments. I don't know if she's specking right now, but she spec'd all of our previous rounds as well. Then I'd like to thank all of our teammates and novices for always coming to tournaments. They're all really good, and even when they don't break, they all show up right there. Then finally, I'd like to thank Arnav for being my partner. I partnered with him late last year, and we've had pretty good success, and I'd say we have pretty good cohesion. I'm really grateful for him. I wouldn't be here without him. Okay, is anyone not ready? We negate. Our sole contention is Biden in a China shop. While the U.S. steps back, Manning 22 writes that Middle East states need to hedge against a fear that the U.S. is no longer dependable. The Israeli-hosted Negev summit with Bahrain, Egypt, and the UAE marked our approachment. Erdogan embarked on his own reconciliation campaign with Saudi Arabia and Israel. A Saudi-Iran detente appears to be slowly taking shape. The new Middle East might work because of a less prominent U.S. Daggers 22 argues that all parties have worked towards de-escalation. A frenzy of diplomatic visits followed to display a warming of ties. Thus, subpoint A is authoritarianism. Affirming emboldens autocrats in two ways. First is through appeasement, and Herb 22 writes that U.S. Middle East diplomacy efforts entail overlooking human rights abuses. Additionally, military aid is coupled with diplomacy. IISS 22 argues, in areas in which allies perceive the U.S. as the traditional guarantor of the status quo in the Middle East to be acceptable, U.S. strategy which leverages diplomacy may have to be wedded to concrete military capabilities. Hoffman 22 writes, America's autocratic partners fuel ongoing conflicts in the region. Through diplomatic assistance, these autocrats have been emboldened and are confident that they will remain shielded by the U.S. from the consequences of reckless behavior. These regimes face no incentives to change their behavior as long as the U.S. continues to support them. Second is through picking sides. Dorsey 21 argues, U.S. policy is to maintain autocratic rule in the belief that it will ensure stability. Revolts in the past decade that toppled Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon suggest that putting a lid on the pot was not a solution. U.S. policy doesn't differ from Chinese and Russian backing of Middle Eastern autocracy. Hashemi 21 finds the U.S. historically has opposed democracy in the region because it's simpler to manipulate a few ruling families than a democratic system. Thus, during times of internal crises, America is coup happy. Amid 15 reports, during Egypt's Arab Spring, the U.S. failed to put pressure, and Egypt's military-led transition through autocratic, dissolved parliament, and reinstated martial law. Secretary of State John Kerry appeared to endorse the coup, saying that the army was averting civil war. In Iraq, Hamortzidaw 21 details the democratic system imposed by the U.S. could never have produced a democracy. The pursuit of neoliberal transformation has produced a failed state. There's two impacts. First is conflict, and Herb continues, autocratic government is the underlying source of instability. Turning away from dictators in the Middle East is how the war there will be resolved and the region finally stabilized. Second is U.S. credibility. Al-Harbi 15 writes, after supporting the region's dictators, others will not take America seriously. These contradictions undermine American credibility. This disrupts cooperation, threatening the rules-based international order. Ren 17 explains that U.S. alliances deter aggressors by meeting a fight with the world's most formidable military. Guarantees allow allies to avert the arms races in earlier eras, which is why Barnett 11 confirms that the U.S. military resulted in a 99% drop in death due to war, with Man 14 concluding reduced allied confidence in America's security guarantees because instability with weapons of mass destruction. Subpoint B is Iranian irony. U.S. re-engagement angers Iran. Bianca 22 writes, although Middle Eastern states have engaged in new dialogue, U.S. policy could prompt them to pivot back towards confrontation. This could reignite conflict in Yemen and Iraq. Saudi and Emirate talks with Iran have helped produce a months-long truce in Yemen. Iran and Saudi Arabia could agree on a permanent solution to Yemen. A renewed U.S. security push could upend this. Empirically, although Saudi 21 writes, Biden's commitment to stepping up diplomacy generated hope, but following Biden's decision, the Houthis dramatically increased cross-border attacks. The rebel group is part of Iran's agenda. Failing to recognize this will lead to misguided policies prolonging the conflict in Yemen. Hardliners perceive U.S. soft power as Western encroachment. Homage 21 argues, focusing on the soft war waged by Western entities, the Islamic Republic intensified repressive moves. American leaders struggle in vain to change the minds of Iran's ruling hardliners. That's why Iranian aggression triggers a regional war. Niehaus 19 confirms, Iran's support for its proxy militias doesn't come from revolutionary zeal, religious goals, or dreams of territorial expansion, but rather a systemic insecurity that comes from U.S. presence. The effects would be devastating conflicts that kill hundreds of thousands of people. Hence, as U.S. diplomacy increases, flashpoints across the Middle East would break out, and we urge a negative ballot.
Okay, before we start, I'm Rahel from Michigan San Jose. I'm just going to give a few thank yous. So first, I'd like to thank my parents for getting me involved in debate in the first place. They've always supported me outside of rounds, and they've motivated me to just keep debating, so thank you. Also to Zed, we've been partnering for almost 3 years now. You're single-handedly make this activity more enjoyable beyond belief. Whether it's silly theatrics or just your humorous nature outside around as well, you are the reason I find so much joy in this activity. And then also I'd like to thank our head coach, Brandon, I think he might be spectating, for just helping us with logistics, and also Mr. Kodani for booking all our flights and hotels. This wouldn't be possible without the two of you. Also Yuvraj and Vadatman from Mission DW, thank you for supporting us throughout the tournament. And we'd also like to thank the tournament organizers, Arizona State, for allowing this tournament to happen and running it pretty smoothly. Also to all the competitors, judges, and coaches for putting all their time and effort into making this tournament happen and making it so enjoyable. Also, a few shout out to some teams and other friends we've made along the way: Palo Alto, Canyon Crest, Polyprep, Oakwood, Doherty Valley, and a few more I've missed. Thank you for making this tournament so enjoyable, and I hope you continue debating. All right. Is everyone ready? So again, this is Mission on the Pro, and I'm the first speaker, Rahel Pasha. I'll start time now. Zed and I affirm, our sole contention is the Arabian Night. A report from the US Senate finds that for decades, America has focused on military operations in West Asia to compensate for the lack of diplomatic involvement. The subsequent wars fought over US presence has made West Asia a ticking time bomb that is bound to explode as new crises emerge. That time is now approaching, as CD22 confirms that for the first time in human civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are drying up, raising tensions between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria over water distribution and hydroelectric power. Without a central actor in the region, Ahmed 21 finds that cultural divisions and ethnic and religious ties will continue to drive a wedge in the Middle Eastern peace process. Luckily, progress is possible. Jewel 22 confirms that Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan signifies a step away from destabilizing operations like invasions and towards programs that foster stability like infrastructure development. Thankfully, increasing U.S. diplomacy to resolve internal armed conflict in West Asia would pacify the Arabian Night in two critical ways. First is the Round Table. American diplomatic efforts are key to West Asian peace. Laralsi 20 concludes that the root cause of failure in recent agreements has been the lack of a central actor like the US, which can organize dialogue between rivaling powers. Indeed, Laralsi indicates that when the US was the de facto leader of peace in the 90s, multilateral summits created agreements on arms control, regional security, and economic development between Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, and more. Now is the time for diplomacy, because in Syria, Lister 22 finds the Assad regime is now vulnerable, since Russia, their largest supporter, is preoccupied with their invasion of Ukraine. Overall, Goldenberg 17 finds that internal armed conflicts like the war in Yemen and Syria have been fueled by Saudi-Iranian competition. Thankfully, increasing diplomatic efforts would mean cultivating agreements between countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. For example, Stark 21 finds that diplomatic envoys from the US played an active role in Saudi-Iranian talks last year and catalyzed support for peace talks in Yemen. While these are small steps, Stark concludes that US diplomatic measures can pave the way to a peaceful Yemen. Absent multilateral peace, conflicts will continue to destabilize the region and displace millions of people. In Yemen and Syria alone, over 40 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. And Fisher 16 finds that if these proxy conflicts between Iran and Saudi Arabia continue, the death toll could be greater than 5 million people. Second is the Kurdish consensus. The Council on Foreign Relations confirms that for centuries, the question of independence for 45 million Kurdish people has remained unaddressed. Despite this, the Kurds remain a key actor in securing a peaceful West Asia. For example, Lovelock 21 confirms that Kurdish militias helped turn the tide in Syria's war on terror by coordinating with the US-led coalition to rout ISIS forces and reclaim 41,000 miles of territory. But today, the injustice against the Kurds has come back to haunt West Asia. Avadi 15 clarifies that Turkey's been attacking Kurdish forces and civilian infrastructure after labeling them as terrorists, and Swell 22 indicates they even plan to invade northern Syria. Similarly, Shamdeen 22 writes, the Iraqi government has also been violently encroaching on Kurdish territories, like in the Shinjar region, where 275,000 people have been displaced by government operations. This state-sponsored assault on the Kurdish way of life has dealt a devastating blow. Lovelock furthers that Kurdish militias have been prevented from locking down ISIS cells due to this resistance, allowing the terrorists to resurge. Well, thankfully, Lovelock concludes that American diplomatic pressure on Turkey can prevent future attacks against the Kurdish militias and revive the counter-terror initiative. Voting affirmative is the only solution, as Brute 17 confirms that successful relations can only be built between Iraq and the Kurds with a mediator, a role the US can play if we stay diplomatically engaged. Indeed, Shamdeen 22 furthers that America has historically used its political leverage to advocate for the independence of minority groups within Iraq and also pressure the government to improve decimated infrastructure. Unfortunately, a modern ISIS state would shatter global security, as the UN writes that in just 2 years, ISIS displaced 3 million refugees and planned chemical weapon attacks that could have killed 12 million people. Ultimately, the Wilson Center concludes that America's reliance on the Kurdish militias ensures that without their support, the US would be forced to use rudimentary counter-terror tactics like large invasions that historically have displaced 38 million people. Thus, Mission San Jose affirms. Okay, do you want the first question?
Sure. So on this argument about the Kurds, right? What is Turkey's incentive to cooperate with the US?
So Turkey has cooperated with the US in the past, and their incentive to do so is very clear, right? Right now, Turkey and the Kurds are both fighting each other, and they're having small skirmishes. The reason why we can create a ceasefire and prevent this is because both sides are basically trying to they have an eye on the same exact territory, right? They're both competing for this area in northern Syria and northern Iraq. If we have the US come to the diplomatic table and bring these countries together to put a firm safe zone and border, then we can prevent them from fighting and redirect their efforts towards fighting ISIS.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
So you said that Turkey previously collaborated with the US in the past, right? So if that was true, why wasn't the ceasefire reached, and why are they?
Oh,
still
it was, right? For example, in the 80s, it was reached. Same thing in 2017.
So why are they
the
still
problem
attacking
is
Kurds?
because we haven't had consistent U.S. diplomatic presence in the area. Instead, we've opted for military invasions and coups, like you talked about. We haven't been able to keep this in place for very long.
So
when you vote for the affirmative side, that's what we do.
Okay, sure.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
All right. So on your argument about dictators and authoritarianism, right?
Yeah.
Your first link doesn't specify a single authoritarian state in the Middle East. So which countries are you impacting to?
Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE. I don't know. I could probably look it up and tell you.
All right. So Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and UAE. Which conflicts are they involved in that would spiral out of control?
Yemen.
Just Yemen?
I mean,
All right.
Yemen is
you
an
can have a
example.
question.
Okay. Sure. On this thing about the round table, right? So would you agree that absent the US, these countries can come together?
Absent the U.S.?
Yeah.
No, they haven't. Again, because of the religious, cultural, and nationalistic divides, empirically they have not been able to come to the negotiating table because no country wants to start these negotiations, wants to start conceding, because that'll make them seem weak. That's why you need a third party, the U.S., that can start these negotiations, bring all the countries to the round table, so then they can then jump on and actually create meaningful diplomacy.
Wait, so what does the US do uniquely to spike discussions?
Despite discussions?
Yeah.
Well, we send special envoys into the region, like in between Saudi Arabia and Iran, to help negotiate peace in Yemen. We also send diplomats to the area in order to tell these countries and also form summits in order to create meaningful diplomacy.
What's special about the envoys?
No, they're called special envoys. They're diplomats.
What do they do?
Yeah.
Okay.
What do? They go to the Saudi Arabian and Iranian heads of state and also other foreign policy leaders, and they basically craft agreements so that the conflict can be resolved peacefully, and potentially they draw a border or they create a ceasefire in order to have some sort of long-term
You have a
peace.
question?
All right, so let's talk about your impact on credibility, right? You say that if we help these authoritarian countries, then no one's going to take the U.S. seriously. So we've been helping authoritarian countries ever since sort of the Gulf War in '91. Why hasn't U.S. credibility led to your big impact?
Because the US is doing a lot of other things with those allies, right?
So
But
what? What is those?
Like
Those are
trade,
things.
I don't know. If we continue to
So why
apply
would we stop
diplomacy-
trade though?
We wouldn't. But the thing is, the unique thing about voting AF is that when you increase diplomacy, you fund more into these authoritarian regimes, and that's really bad because it causes all the other countries to hate us. That's gross.
So before I start, I'd like to give a few speech. It might be a bit long, sorry. Okay, so the first person I'd like to thank are my parents for supporting me throughout my entire debate career. Without them, I would be nowhere close to where I am. And with that, I'd also like to thank my novice year captains, Pranav and Meta. They're also sitting right there, as Shay told you. They're the main reason that I'm still in debate and that I've become the debater I am today. They're pretty much my biggest inspirations, and they're the reason I do debate. I'd also like to thank all of my teammates who supported me throughout this entire journey. Some of them are sitting here with me right now. And then I'd mainly also like to thank my sponsors, Mrs. Berkshire and Hamilton's admin, because unlike most schools, we didn't actually have a debate program and it was actually going down, but teachers like her came and helped us save the program, and she comes with us to nearly every tournament. I'd like to thank tons of debaters that I've met throughout. I can't possibly name all of them, but for some like Peyton, Zach, all my teammates. And then I'd like to also thank certain coaches who helped me throughout, like Slowly Murkva, Saket Mahendra. Finally, I'd like to thank ASU for running such an amazing tournament and being such a great host, allowing teams like independent entries and having tons of inclusion, which we've had a lot of trouble with in the past with many tournaments, which I won't name specifically, but many tournaments don't allow us to enter due to inclusion reasons, and they don't allow entries like independence. So we just really appreciate it, because this debate season I've been spending more time on logistics, and we really appreciate ASU being such an inclusive and fair tournament. Okay. It's just going to be down to this. Start at the top, their own ticking time bomb about this water crisis is a uniqueness that they can't solve. The US can't just bring water into the region and somehow solve for this. They provide no solvency. Secondly, their uniqueness is postdated by us, which is just from 2 months ago, indicating that talks are actually occurring. All their evidence that the US sent diplomatic envoys to actually solve this is exactly our argument. We shouldn't be increasing diplomacy. We should be maintaining our multilateral ties that we have right now with all these other countries. We tell you that if the vote for the negative, the US stays in the backseat, just has tiny envoys staying there and continues a multilateral discussion. Rather, when you affirm, you go into this unipolarity situation in which the US tries to enforce itself as the main diplomatic tool, turning all of their arguments against them. Second of all, post-date, like all of our uniqueness post-dates that there's direct talks being held. We give you all the empirics, such as all these countries like Bahrain, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all of them coming together to talk. Since uniqueness controls the direction through the link, if we can prove that the negative solves for all these conflicts that is happening right now, then we win this round. Let's go to their first argument. They say the US has a lack of centralization and multilateral agreements work. We agree, multilateral agreements works. That's why they're working right now without the US playing too big of a role. Rather, when the US does play too big of a role, countries like Iran get mad that the US is taking the advantage of these situations and they're always being antagonized. Hence, you always weigh our arguments over theirs. Second of all, they don't provide any solvency. What type of unique diplomacy is the US going to do that didn't solve in the past that will somehow work today? There's no uniqueness. Let's go to this Kurdish argument. Here's where they have a lot of problems. First, they say that the Kurdish need assistance and that US can somehow mediate. There's a few problems. No link. Diplomacy fails. 2 warrants. A, trust. Bills 22 writes Turkey and the United States are in an atmosphere of mutual mistrust. Ankara is irked about Washington's actions, which it considers to be demonstrably against Turkey's interests. Americans don't like Erdogan, hence the alleged attempt to get rid of him with the failed coup in 2016. C. Ward writes, the US may not resist since it wants Turkey, a NATO ally, to accept Sweden and Finland's accession to the alliance. If that's the case, it seems the US may stand aside as Turkey kills more Kurds in Syria. In the past, the US has never been able to actually prevent this conflict. The reason is because things like the NATO alliance, in which Turkey just forces us and uses their leverage in vetoing plans to stop us. But second of all, the US and this antagonism is a reason that it's terminal defense against their case, because if you vote for the affirmative, then it only worsens the conflict since Turkey hates the United States. If you call for their own evidence, it says US was able to cooperate with the Syrian Kurdish forces, not Turkey in specific. Their other evidence about ceasefires is way too much in the past. Our evidence post-dates from 2022, which indicates right now is when Turkey hates us the most and has an antagonistic relationship. Then, go to this argument about they tell you that ISIS will cause all these deaths and ISIS is resurging. When there's no evidence that ISIS is actually resurging or has any power, there's no precedence of a chemical attack being used by ISIS. If that was true, the hundreds of other terrorist organizations in the Middle East would do that anyways. Their impact is pretty terrible. B, we'd say we outweigh for a few reasons. First of all is our authoritarian impact. When authoritarian leaders get the governmency, that causes all this instability in the governments because historically they're the ones who oppress their citizens. They prerequisite to their argument because now the entire Middle East becomes authoritarian, then just more of these governments supporting terrorism proliferate and terrorism just increases. Second of all, we'd say we outweigh on prerequisite for a second reason. When US credibility is used, that's the only way diplomacy has ever been able to work. Basically, the US's strategy is we have this entire alliance, such as the United Nations and all these countries who rely on us and support us to support our actions. That's the only way diplomacy has worked in the past. So if we can prove that American credibility doesn't increase, and if you vote for the affirmative, American credibility crashes, it's a prerequisite to their argument because then we never be able to solve for any of the conflicts they themselves talk about. then we'd say their argument, or go back to their first contention, we'd say their impact again here is really improbable. They just say diplomatic envoys played a big role. No, they didn't. The US is just sitting in the back, just trying to watch the relations happen, which still happens in the negative world. There's no uniqueness.
I have a few thank yous to give first. I'm not gonna set the timer. Alright, so first and foremost, I'd like to thank my mom. This is someone who's like probably listened to more speeches than like the average judge, because I used to have a really difficult time, being confident, and so I would go to my mom and deliver the speech. And so through helping me build better drills, helping me argue better, and helping me to just feel more confident in myself, my mom has shaped me so much as a person and as a debater. And I always thought that when Rahel and I got to like the finals of a tournament, like she would be able to be there and watch. But now I realize that the reason why it was meant to happen when I'm far away from home is that I could know that the lessons she taught me don't just apply to debate, and I can take them wherever I go, whether it's to Arizona, whether it's to college, whether it's anywhere else, which is why I'm really grateful for that. Next, for my dad, who sent me a text 20 minutes ago saying I have to thank the nation of Scotland. So, thanks, Scotland. Next to coaches, first, Ben Kirsch, who, nice job, I kind of forgot him.
Yeah.
But Ben Kirsch, who's been my coach for 2 years. I really have so much I can say about Ben. He's the most charismatic, analytically inclined, and just simplistic individual I've ever met. His capacity to convince me that arguments are incredibly smart or incredibly useless in almost an instant is just a testament to his ultimate intellect. Next to Nathaniel Yoon, who's been key in teaching me and Rahel how to do things like weighing and stuff. Hopefully we'll see a little bit more of that in the round. Next to other coaches that we've had, Brandon Stewart, who is our team coach, who's carried us to tournaments and helped us be able to compete on the national circuit and allow Mission San Jose to be a competitive team at every single level. Next to the teams who we've met on the circuit, first to Mission, Bidatman, Yuvraj, Selena, Videsh, Brandon once again, and to all the debaters that came before and all of them that will come after. You are all an inspiration to us, and we hope that the actions that we take, sort of inspire you. Next to college prep, Tanish, thank you for refilling my water and helping me at tournaments always. Angelina, sorry I messed up your name earlier in the tournament. Who's this? Oh yeah, William Peroni, thanks for letting me semifinal the TOC. Sabrina, thanks for always reading crazy responses. Ahmad and Arnav, thank you for being the next generation. Miraloma, thank you. Leo, Palo Alto, Yash, and Daniel, you both are an inspiration to both of us, and it's fantastic hanging around with you at the tournament. To Harker, y'all are good people. And last and finally, I'd like to thank Mr. the one and only Rahel Pasha, everyone. It literally doesn't get better than this. That's all I'm gonna have to say. All right. Oh, hey, congrats. Thank you to Hamilton for giving me that rebuttal. You're not ready. Okay. Market Stepis. Time starts. Now, on the first response about raw water, they missed the uniqueness of our argument. We are saying that moving forward, water is an impetus for conflict, which means that increasing diplomacy now is key to securing future peace. All of their arguments about current status quo conflicts, our arguments impact into the future, we outweigh on scope. Next, they say that countries are coming to the table right now, but they have conceded our analysis that are coming to the table because the United States is sending these diplomatic envoys, assuring countries of the United States' continual interests. Our advocacy is that increasing diplomacy brings everyone to the table, only increasing the agreements that they're talking about. Next, on our argument about the round table, they say that it's working right now. And that increasing diplomacy is somehow going to cause Iranian aggression. There's no analysis done as to why increasing diplomacy is a bright line for Iranian aggression. If it's happening right now, we should have seen some semblance of their impact, but you don't, which means their argument isn't scalar and it doesn't apply. Next, they say that there's no solvency for the argument, but our evidence indicates the envoys have worked in the past. In 2021, they're building assurances and they're building the regional alliances, but what's most important is that because we've withdrawn our presence primarily, our evidence indicates as of 4 days ago that the Yemen conflict is resurging once again, which is why affirming is key in order to secure future peace. Go to Kurds who's signing your ballot here, group their response into two groups. First, they talk to you about how Turkey doesn't trust the United States. That doesn't make any sense. First of all, their evidence literally says that Turkey understands that a mutual failure of agreements between the US and Ankara is bad, which means they always have an incentive to come to the table for the analysis Rahel gave you. Second of all, our evidence indicates the United States has a larger presence in NATO, which means that we can always pressure Turkey to come to the table. They say Turkey would get mad and to do more bad actions against the Kurds. They can't do that because the United States inflicts genuine costs on their aggression through leverage, which is why they wouldn't be able to do this. Next, on their argument about how they say there's no evidence of resurgence, they have conceded the Iraq evidence, which is the best piece of evidence around verbatim. It says ISIS is resurging with the events right now. They said there's no precedent of chemical attacks. Yeah, that's literally the argument. The Kurds were able to stop the chemical attacks before they happened. On the way, they say authoritarian leaders oppress citizens, which is the linkage to our impact. No, it's not. Our argument is that the resurgence of an existing terrorist groups, which means they do their own galvanization on a larger scope than the authoritarian countries. Lastly, on the prerequisite, this literally isn't a prereq. The U.S. has done atrocities around the globe, yet the credibility from U.S. military presence around the world has meant that we can still stage our presence. This prereq doesn't apply. Go to their case. At the top, they have conceded the Senate evidence. It's round ending. It indicates that the United States only does military interventions when we don't have diplomacy. This means a vote for a pro is a vote for away from militarism and a vote for diplomacy. Moving forward, because there'll be more conflict, that means militarism increases in the next world. This takes out their argument on authoritarianism. A, direct U.S. military presence obviously emboldens authoritarian governments to a larger extent because they scapegoat the U.S. presence as a reason to increase nationalism, which stokes terrorism and probably co-ops their weighing as well. But then second of all, it turns the internal link of their Iran argument because their evidence is the worst thing I've ever seen. It says that Iran gets aggressive when the U.S. increases its military presence, which is what we're directly stopping. Go to their sole contention. They give you two examples of regionalism. First is on Niger. This makes no sense. The U.S. negotiated the Abraham Accords that literally happened at the summit. Second, Turkey's only increasing its cooperation because they want to increase their arms sales. Our advocacy is that regionalism is only possible with the United States. Next, they talk about a Saudi and Iran detente. Our advocacy is that increasing regionalism for what we're talking about because the United States is a multilateral actor is far better than the bilateral diplomacy that they're advocating for because it brings all the smaller actors to the table who do have a stake in the conflict and who also don't want the escalations. Next, on authoritarianism, the United States is repivoted. We've condemned Saudi Arabia's actions, which means that moving forward, increasing diplomacy means that we just do more of this. Next, their argument is terrible. It says that we need to have a concrete military presence. A, we already have 5,000 troops in the Middle East. That's enough. We don't need to increase any more. Second of all, the U.S. has capabilities around the world. They don't give you any analysis as to why this isn't enough. Next, on picking sides. These two arguments are literally the same because the first relies on the fact that the U.S. supports authoritarian governments. I'd advocate that if the U.S. didn't, China and Russia would do it to a larger extent and they're worse. A, they've historically genocided populations of Muslims within their borders like Uyghurs, for example. Second of all, they're authoritarian regimes who literally specialize in supporting autocracies for a living. And third of all, they're socialist regimes who have historically supported socialist governments like the Ba'ath Party, which caused the Arab Spring protests to begin with. They're solving a problem they created. On Iran, this argument is, or on the conflict scenario, this makes no sense. U.S. has always had some credibility. It's been able to stop back. On Iran, this argument is terrible. First of all, Iran's looking to get poked. Second of all, their evidence is horribly misconstrued. It indicates that a U.S. military presence will make them aggressive. A vote for the pro is a vote away from militarism. And lastly, there's no way that Iran becomes aggressive because they can't afford to be excluded from regional politics. Thus, we negate. Affirm. You can have the first question.
Right. Starts. Do we agree that the U.S. is solving diplomacy right now? Like it's fostering regional cooperation right now?
Current efforts are a window into what would happen on a much larger and more efficient scale when you affirm, because it means that we'd be increasing our diplomatic presence. Current mechanisms also show that the United States supports regionalism. Our argument is that when America diverts more resources to diplomacy, like they should in West Asia, we use the current tactics on a much broader scale because it proves that there's political will to do it as it's happening right now. I have a question.
That wasn't my question. The question is the U.S. solving, like you cited the Abraham Accords, all these tensions de-escalate.
Sure.
Is the U.S. solving these conflicts right now?
The history of U.S. involvement in West Asia is a series of engagements and withdrawals. Our argument is that during the periods of diplomatic engagements, we saw peace agreements like the Najaf Summit, we saw peace in Yemen, but now that the United States is moving away in the status quo, that means that A, the Yemeni conflict is resurging as of 4 days ago, but then second of all, it also means that the United States should re-intervene because the windows that we have in the past of securing peace are what we're going to see in the future.
So the U.S. is stepping back right now?
Yeah. Can I have
So
a
they're
question?
taking out diplomats, like is what you're saying.
No, our argument is that the United States is pivoting away its political capital towards focusing on other places. That means we have the same amount of diplomats in the region, but A, a vote for the pro is more diplomats, but B, we give them more power and more capability in order to engage in diplomatic talks in the region to secure peace. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Sure. Let's talk about your argument about credibility, right? So the United States intervened militarily in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and all these other places, and that has had a pretty terrible impact on American credibility. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
So we were still, but during that time period, the United States was still a member of the UN. It was still a member of NATO. It was still creating these broad, like, global organizations, right?
No.
No? The United States withdrew from the UN.
When they withdraw from the UN, the US was not being as active an actor, and they had much more enemies when they started doing these conflicts. They had much more enemies.
But that
For
doesn't
example,
matter,
we
right?
give you specific empirics that now when the US goes into the Middle East, they're antagonized by them, and the Middle East doesn't want the US there.
So-
For example, you said our evidence was trash, but like the evidence is pretty good to tell you the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, when the US increased diplomacy in the region, they started increasing the conflict, which is why your Yemen card that you have says that Yemen's conflict restarted. started.
Well,
Because
that's
US
not really
created-
true. Your evidence is from 2018, mine is from 2023, so it doesn't apply. But the second thing I will also say is, look, on this whole picture of the fact that U.S. credibility is key for maintaining global organizations, I just don't think that's key. That's true, right? Because your impact is talking about a broad global war, right? Our argument in response to this, which your question doesn't really address, is the fact that the United States still stays involved in organizations like the UN, like NATO, peacekeeping organizations that aren't dependent on U.S. credibility because we have so much military presence around the world that we can stage it no matter what happens to us. Which means any marginal decrease in American credibility is always met with an increase of diplomacy.
Yeah, first of all, our evidence is from 2022 about Houthis increasing their attacks in Yemen.
2023 is a bill later.
Okay, I'll respond to that later. But wait,
I'm gonna respond to the fact
exactly.
that
That's our
2023 is later.
that's our argument. Americans increased diplomacy in the region. Iranian-backed Houthi rebels started increasing attacks, which is why we're seeing the Yemen conflict restarting. But second,
That's
to your
crossfire.
But you can finish.
Oh yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, my bad. To your other thing about American credibility, that's not our argument. Sure, the U.S. is still in the UN and all these other organizations. We're saying specifically the U.S. ally system, the interconnectedness of all their allies, is what's prevented them from proliferating and making their own militaries, which is averted arms race. But we'll get to that.
It's gonna be Meg, then Wayne. Everyone ready? Okay, cool. Right now, all Middle Eastern states are increasing their diplomacy and solving their own conflicts because it seems that the U.S. is not dependable as seen by a rapidly approaching peace settlement in Yemen, and many countries come together to settle their own differences in a diplomatic fashion. However, when you affirm and increase U.S. engagement, it'll be seen by Iran as Western encroachment. This was proven empirically when Iran retaliated against U.S. diplomatic efforts in Yemen by funding the Houthis and launching airstrikes. Increased Iranian aggression as a result will trigger them to continue funding more proxies, be more aggressive, and increase conflict, killing hundreds of thousands of people. They barely respond to this Iran argument. It's really, really good for us because it's basically considered out of a boat. First of all, on their uniqueness evidence, it's trash. It's absolute trash. You can read it. A, they don't cut it, and B, it literally never says that Yemen, the Yemen conflict started. It just says that both sides are preparing for war. It's really, really garbage evidence. They probably found it in the middle of ground. Don't believe it. That's why you prefer our evidence because we have to take into account this Yemeni conflict and says Iran and Saudi Arabia are collaborating currently to said that Iran and Saudi Arabia are collaborating currently to make a permanent solution in Yemen. That always their argument because it's probably more recent in A, and it also takes into account the U.S. Then they say that they can turn Iran because absent diplomacy we would do military intervention. But A, they can see that absent the U.S. diplomacy is working right now, which means that we don't need to do military intervention. And B, they can see and B on the turn to Iran, that our evidence is really good in saying that empirically U.S. soft power specifically is what made Iran aggressive and made them launch airstrikes on Iran. They say that Iran is looking to get poked all of the other responses to overtime. They say that Iran is looking to get poked, which means that they're going to do anything. But no, it's not. If it was, it would have started the conflict a while ago. But the uniqueness is that they're going to start a conflict right now when we increase diplomacy. The bright light is affirming. Then go to the way. We pre-wreck their argument because Iran starts conflict and is literally the biggest state sponsor of terrorism. If the U.S. angers Iran, it'll start funding these proxies and terrorism even more, and it'll probably also get involved in Syria, which means that more proxies happen, more conflicts happen, and more deaths happen. And even then, it probably always on scope because Iran can start funding proxies everywhere around the globe, everywhere around the entire region, which means that we outweigh on scope and kill and save more people. Then on their argument about the Arabian Nights. First of all, they say that their impacts impacting the future means that they outweigh on time frame or something. This makes no sense. You have to prefer impacts that have already happened, which is our impacts, which empirically happen, and you know that they might happen in the future. Then they say that the U.S. is sending envoys. These envoys have literally not done anything to solve any conflicts in the Middle East. That's why the infection that they're taking into their own hands and are solving the conflicts right now. Then they say that the U.S. is going to bring everyone to the table, but we don't need to right now, which is why you vote nay. That's where you sign your ballot because right now in the Middle East, all these countries are coming together. Erdogan is reconciliating his relationships with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran are also reconciliating their relationships and having a detente to solve the Yemeni conflict. That's why the bright line is affirming. When you affirm, the second you affirm, you anger Iran, start war conflict, start war proxies, and you reverse all of our progress. Then on this Kurds argument, it's absolute trash. They say that we tell you that diplomacy is always going to fail because Turkey and the U.S. are an atmosphere of mutual distrust, and the U.S. and Turkey uses NATO as leverage to stop any diplomacy. They say that Turkey understands failure is bad, but right under that it says Turkey is urged by the U.S. means that they're never going to engage in conversation. And B, we say that Turkey has leverage over the U.S., which is why they're never actually going to engage in any form of conversation because they hate the U.S. That's why we have not seen anything work in the past, and we're never going to see anything work in the future. There's nothing different when you vote out, but the only thing that is different is Iran getting mad and killing everyone.
9 seconds.
I don't think we'll need more. Okay, this is the AF summary, right? We'll be starting off sort of defending our case, and then move on to weighing and then their case. Everyone ready? Awesome. I'll start time Now, it is very clear in this round you're voting for our second contention about the Kurds. Right now, the Turkish and Iraqi governments are destroying the military and civilian infrastructure in Kurdistan, and this is extremely important because it's the only barrier to the resurgence of ISIS. Kurdistan has always been a critical counter-terror ally in keeping ISIS attacks low. But when you vote for the affirmative side for mission, you increase U.S. diplomatic efforts, we can pressure Turkey and Iraq as well to stop their destabilizing operations and prevent the return of ISIS that could create attacks that kill 12 million people through chemical weapon attacks, and also force the U.S. to then re-intervene in the region and start another war on terror to fight ISIS. They give you a few responses here. First, they just tell you that, oh, Turkey's not going to want to negotiate with the US because they don't trust us. Again, first of all, this does not address the Iraq portion of our argument, and a lot of Kurdistan is in northern Iraq. Actually, the majority of it is. So we access most of our argument. But secondly, it's important to know that Turkey has negotiated with the US, and we have created ceasefires back in the 80s when we did do diplomacy, and in 2017 for a very short period of time. Why is this true? Well, it's because, again, Turkey wants to have peace. They want to have regional security. They don't want to be fighting a war right on their south of the border. On top of that, they talk about NATO, but the US literally spends most of their military presence on NATO. It's the US that's helping Turkey and protect them through the alliance. It's the US that has leverage over Turkey, not the other way around. At that point, let's go to the Wang. Again, our argument about Kurdistan is so much more important than theirs about Iran. They give you one prerequisite about how, oh, Iran can just fund ISIS. But again, even though Iran did fund terrorist groups back in the initial war on terror, the Kurds were still able to be effective at countering them and reclaim 41,000 miles of territory. What does this mean? Well, it means their prereq doesn't actually take out our argument. Even if Iran funds ISIS, we're still effective at counterterrorism. But our prereq still takes out theirs. Why? It's because when ISIS does resurge and there is no Kurdistan to actually prevent them from actually taking over regions in Iraq and Syria, what we see is Iran take advantage of this opportunity and actually fund these proxies, starting more conflicts in the area and destabilizing the region. It's very clear here the Wang and the Kurdistan argument is on our side. This is why you're voting pro for Mission San Jose. Now let's go above and beyond and address their argument on Iran specifically. One important thing to note, our turn about Russia and China filling in is completely conceded. This is extremely important because if the US doesn't increase diplomacy in the region, then Russia and China would use this opportunity to extend their own influence. This directly takes out their case because if Russia, one of Iran's only allies, starts increasing diplomatic and possibly also military presence in the region, we see Iran get more emboldened, have a greater reason to actually start proxies, whether that's in Yemen or in Syria and Iraq, and it's a better reason to vote for us. But also specifically on their link, there's a few reasons why there's absolutely no way you can vote for this here. First of all, it's important to note that Iran did negotiate with the United States last year when we did step up talks in Yemen. That's really, really critical because right now the war in Yemen is actually restarting as of 4 days ago. They tell you that Arkansas isn't cut. That's because our dock wasn't loading. We have cut it for previous rounds and other judges have seen it. At the end of the day, it's important to know that if right now the region is unstable, the only risk of solvency is voting affirmative. It's by increasing U.S. diplomacy, and it's why you're voting F.
Thank you for that.
So this argument about like your evidence or your you said like your card says the Yemen conflict is starting. Does it specifically state that the two sides have started to attack each other?
Yeah.
So the evidence says that both sides are gearing up for war again.
Because the ceasefires failed.
Yeah, because the ceasefires failed.
So why haven't they started attacking each other?
Well,
why
going-
is like gearing
So,
up?
like, obviously, I'm not in Yemen right now. I can't tell you, like, who's fighting who, but I can tell you that as both sides are increasing their militarism and both sides are ramping up, this proves that moving forward, conflict is increasingly likely. Maybe that's
I
what
can tell you who's fighting. Like it's like with the Iranians.
Well, no, I know that, right? But I can't tell you. But I understand that. All I said was I'm not in Yemen right now. I can't tell you if they are physically shooting at each other, but I can tell you that both sides are re-engaging their military presence and pivoting towards more offensive postures, which indicate that they are willing to go to war again.
I did. Well, I don't respond to that really quickly. I'm not in Yemen either, but I can cite your own evidence, which is like probably like some surveillance that we have like actually in Yemen, which says the two armies have not started firing at each other yet, which is just like your assertion that it will restart.
This happened 5 days ago. Again, it is an emerging situation. Both sides are probably just analyzing their previous battle tactics and gearing up for conflict once again.
No, if they're gearing up for conflict, if they're going back to the battlegrounds, that is a violation of the ceasefire, right? Because at the end of the day, if this negotiation that happened last year isn't working, if they're not actually de-escalating the conflict and they're building up, that shows that without the U.S., diplomacy is not working between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Houthis.
Nowhere does it say like we're building up armies or we're going to the battleground.
That's literally
It just says we're preparing for war.
Yeah.
Yes,
What is preparing for war?
Well, when you prepare for war, you want to be able to fight the war, which means that you increase your presences on the battlefield, engage in offensive postures, such that you are able to fight the war that you are doing.
like 5 gauge or something.
I'm not talking about the
Yeah,
United
that's like
States. We're saying that the
Riyadh,
Houthis
not
and
Yemen.
the Yemeni government are gearing up for war. You're cross-applying arguments that are entirely different.
Let's do it. Sure.
Okay, so let's talk about Iran, right? So apart from Yemen, right? You mentioned the scope weighing about how Iran wants to start proxy conflicts elsewhere, right? So where else does Iran have like ambitions?
Actually, Iran funds proxies all over the region. For example, they're even in Yemen. They're funding the.
So again, apart from Yemen, that's one argument, right? I'm saying, as per your scope weighing, where else is Iran going to start these conflicts?
Considering this wasn't like a response earlier, can I have something?
No, I just
We're
want
asking you
clarity.
to clarify your
Yeah.
weighing, because right now if you just say scope, it's going to happen, everyone's going to die because of Iran, but we don't
But
know
your
where
only
these wars are
example is
happening.
Yemen.
Yeah, so there's like all these things like Hamas, Hezbollah, like I don't know, like Iran funds all of these like terrorist groups and all these proxies just all around the region in general. And in the past, the proxies they funded killed hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Time starts. Now, uniqueness debate is where you vote for us. They just give you this evidence from 5 days ago that says they're preparing for war, but their own evidence says the Houthis haven't started attacking yet. That means as long as these peace talks continue to work, this actual firing won't happen. Our uniqueness is better than theirs because we provide examples of actual talks like the Saudi-Iran detente happening. The reason these attacks haven't started yet. Preparing is just too vague. Call for their evidence. Look at it. Nowhere does it say we started firing. Hence, if you vote for the negative, you're just voting for these conflicts to be solved regardless. They're never actually going to start this war again. When you vote for the affirmative, however, our argument is pretty simple. Whenever you affirm and U.S. increases diplomacy, increases engagement in the region, Iran gets really angry because the U.S. has historically always been against Iran. As a result, Iran gets angry, starts funding proxies all across the region who have empirically killed hundreds of thousands of people. Their only response to this argument is that, one, the uniqueness argument, which is they're already restarting conflict, which no, they're not. Nowhere, it was just power tag. The conflict hasn't started, just as they're gearing up. It's too vague. You can't vote on it. Second, they try to extend this China-Russia turn. One, they consider our uniqueness that U.S. is still in the backseat in the region. It doesn't just mean that China and Russia can randomly fill in with no warranting provided. Why would China and Russia just come in? Are they here right now? It's too vague, not implicated to vote on. Second, on the weighing debate, we say we prerequisite because whenever Iran increases their proxies and starts funding all these groups across the region, it causes increased terrorism. All these conflicts just get exacerbated, like funding ISIS. They say, no, the Kurds can solve for this. No, our argument is just terrorism in general in the region. They can fund all of it, and on scope weighing, this still outweighs, they haven't responded to it, that all these terrorists in the region still get access to arms. Their prerequisite doesn't exist because they're just saying Iran will randomly start funding the ISIS if Kurds go down. There's no analysis of why that happens. Go to their argument. Another reason to vote for us, again, they've conceded in rebuttal that U.S. leverage, the U.S. does not have leverage in NATO because Turkey can veto their plans, and as a result, Turkey is the one with leverage over NATO. It wasn't a response in rebuttal. It's an easy place to vote for us, which means U.S. can't actually control them to stop attacking the Kurds. And second, they've always had mutual mistrust. You can call for the evidence right underneath that says they've always had mutual mistrust. They're never going to work together. There's no solvency at all for the affirmative. It's a clean negative ballot. Right?
Seems I have been given the honor of the last speech in the tournament, so hopefully I can make it count. Is anyone not ready? It's going to start on the weighing debate. Is anyone not ready? My time begins now. You have two weighing mechanisms. They say their argument weighs on scope because Iran is going to start funding proxies around the globe. Our argument is specific to an empirical rise of an existing terrorist group which has historically destabilized the region. Our evidence indicates that if ISIS resurges because we don't have the Kurds as counter-terror allies, that now means that Iran would be able to start funding terrorism on a larger scale and they become emboldened because they are the largest state sponsor of terrorism. How do you adjudicate between the two weighing mechanisms? They didn't tell you, but I will. Prefer ours on clarity. One, we're talking about an actual terrorist organization, whereas their argument just asserts that Iran would start funding these other groups without engaging with the actual geopolitical consequences of doing so. But then second of all, I'd advocate that our prereq still solves theirs insofar as the United States increasing diplomacy with the Kurds means that moving forward we'd have more counter-terror allies because they empirically see that the United States is supporting people who fight terror, which means moving forward the only path to the ballot and the only resolvability you have as a judge is on our argument about Kurds. It's very simple and it goes like this. The United States would use its diplomatic pressure to resolve talks between Turkey, Iraq, and the Kurds, which is very important because historically historically, Turkey and Iraq have been encroaching onto Kurdish territory, preventing them from locking down ISIS cells, allowing the group to resurge. They give you one response to this argument. It's not persuasive at all. They say that Turkey has a larger leverage. They have conceded Rahel's response that the U.S. has larger leverage at NATO because we have the majority of our military presence there. But second of all, their own evidence says mutual mistrust. The part they didn't highlight, and this is what we've been saying the whole round, says there is an incentive for both sides to cooperate because mutual mistrust is not something that the countries want, which is moving forward. Regardless, this argument concedes half of my argument, which is about Iraqi Kurdistan. They don't read a single response here. At that point, the link is conceded, the weighing is conceded, the round is over. But let's go to their case about Iran. They try to indict my evidence saying that the war started that the war is beginning to start up again 4 days ago. Their only response here says that that gearing up for war is not actual conflict. But if you're gearing up for war, it indicates that in the future the countries and the sides engaged in the conflict are going to come to the are not going to come to the table because they're turning towards militarism instead. Regardless, this proves that whatever diplomacy they're talking about, this whole uniqueness narrative that they try to go to, doesn't apply because the diplomacy is short term and keeps requiring U.S. intervention. At that point, we are very proud to affirm.